Well, thank you. That was a wonderful bit of time tourism. I'm always puzzled as a sociologist by the readiness with which other kinds of scientists adapt this term, which is from Pierre Bourdieu, of capital. And so could you just start off by saying why you think this metaphor is appropriate for talking about land?
Over the years, I've used a lot of different metaphors for that, different adaptations, but I really got it from Billy Lee Turner. I don't know if any of you know him. He's a American member of the National Academy of Sciences, a wonderful scholar at Arizona State. I've known him for many, many years. And he started using this phraseology as he looked at these landscapes in the past, and it made a lot of sense to me because it showed something that I hadn't thought about as much before, is that when people put in sustainable capital into a landscape, it really improves the landscape for them. Not always improves it for biodiversity, but later on it may, in some cases, as it attracts it after there's a collapse. But what it does is allow them to live through extremes, the hazards, the droughts and floods, the environmental degradation. And so to look at it as the capital we build up in a bank in that case, I think, as well. And what we see is going back into it is to see that it's something that is, by LiDAR now, everywhere. Everywhere you walk is some aspect of or some aspect of ancient Maya land use. Some of it was very sustainable capital. Those terraces are still in place under tropical forests, which have this remarkable ability to bioturbate, rip up the landscape, but those terraces are still in place after 1,000+ years, and they're doing very well, better than some of the Roman terraces that were there for a little longer. So that's my particular view of it. I have to give my credit to Billy Lee Turner, though.
You are actually cashing the metaphor in terms of banking.
Yes, cashing.
Yeah, interesting, thanks. Marcelo.
Really very, very interesting paper. I want to ask two things. First, when I visit this location in Mexico, the people say that the catastrophe was, the cause of the catastrophe was a meteorite. In some time, they have a meteorite to put these forms, I don't know what.
First, I'll give you a quick, I think. Yeah, should I answer this first or go? Okay, very, very quickly, the whole region was created by the Chicxulub impact crater 65 million years ago because it hit into shallow ocean and then created ejecta blankets across the whole landscape. And so the Maya world, in some senses, was fertilized by that ejecta blanket because there's a lot of macronutrients in that landscape that wouldn't be in other tropical forest regions because of it, partly. But the Maya collapse itself has been, I'm using the passive voice on purpose, has been attributed to many things, including meteorites, but there is zero evidence for it so far.
The second thing is if you have some study in this kind of approach to the Argentina Pampa, that is charismatic or not? These are the very nice, that the land is charismatic. This is another metaphor, very interesting. But this is the question. If you have studied the Argentina Pampa,
unfortunately, it's one of the places I always wanted to go to, and I haven't been there, but in the same special issue of Pages magazine, we had a whole one by Claudia Latorre on collapses around societies in the world, and there was a good one on Argentina that I'm very happy to send on to you. Very nicely done. I wish I'd been there myself.
At the moment of collapse.
Well, thank you very much. This is a great paper. The account that you gave of that period among the Mayas, which was relatively constant consumption because of technological innovations of terracing, reminds me of a paper in contemporary Bangladesh by Billy Turner and Ali, which has a very similar tone to it. You might want to refer to that because it's in the face of population pressure. There was more collective action against storms, hurricanes, and so forth, plus terracing, and to diversionary tactics to get the rivers more controlled, because the rivers shift a lot in the wetlands of Bangladesh. So that leads me to ask you the following question. When we talk, we use the word collapse quite readily these days because of Diamond's book, at least those who are not archaeologists like myself. We think of that as a distress migration, perhaps. So what has collapsed is that locality.
Exactly.
And we haven't tracked what happened to them. After all, the Irish left Ireland, and they didn't quite collapse as a culture. It's just that
they did suffer, though.
They suffered. Oh, that's for sure. Now, I guess if you can't track what happened to them after they migrated, then what you have is record of a collapse. And then there are those where people are suffering but haven't collapsed, like the Bangladesh case, that Billy Turner, and the Mayan case. They're in a bad way, but they persist because they're innovating just enough to be able to keep in bands the loss of productivity or whatever is happening. And then there are the third, which our culture now brags about all the time, that we overcome these and make ourselves even better. That's the triumphalist literature which we're trying to counter here, because we are seeing symptoms of difficulties which are unlikely to be easily met. Is this a reasonable classification, or are there structures that are missed in this three-way?
I think that anytime we try to develop an overarching kind of group of ideas about that, there are probably other things that could explain various kinds of things. The last one explains things for some period of time. There's no doubt about it. I think in the Peace of Augustus, we look back, we're right in the heart of this period, you could see that things were going fairly well with Roman agriculture and terracing throughout parts of the Roman Empire, for an example in that case. And the collapse did come later after that particular point. So I think that the latter one works in some cases. It may work in America. America always likes to use that kind of braggadocio about its record and how it's done so well because of its own goodness. It's, what's the term they always use? Exceptionalism, right? Well, there's been a lot of problems as well. And a lot of that erosion I showed before indicates, or we have vast areas of the United States that are completely unusable because of soil erosion. So even within that idea that we've somehow overcome that, we still have a swath of the southeastern United States that runs from Texas to Georgia all the way along that's not usable, except for growing very poor crops of pine trees. I think the first two parts of that too are useful, I think, as well. I'm sure there are more complicated ones, and maybe Ann has some of those. So,
just want to comment on that the soil there basically caused the Civil War very nearly, because the reason that Lincoln became so unpopular was over the issue of whether or not what would happen to the states to the west of the Mississippi, where the cotton growers wanted to move and the tobacco growers, because they had ruined the soils of the southeast. So these things carry through to very big social situation.
Yeah, so they have those social ramifications that keep going on and on and on, even to today.
Yeah, right.
In fact, you can look at voter records and patterns, geographic patterns across the southeastern United States and recognize soil erosion problems in the past.
So, whether Pater would buy a case for inserting a third stage before his present third stage, which would be migration and diaspora.
Yeah, right.
Yeah?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I think the Green Sahara is a good example of that. What we don't know about the Green Sahara situation was how rapidly that occurred, because we don't have that evidence in between. We do know that these groups related to them showed up along the Nile later on in that habitat tracking area. Some have gone further to say, well, and that caused Egyptian civilization. Well, I'm not going to go so far as to say that, but.
You say
well, just to comment on Partha's trajectory there. So I've collaborated for over a decade now with archaeologists in the Southwest and 5 different cultural groups, asking very similar questions, right? We saw what Jared Diamond would call collapse in most of those groups. In fact, only one persists today, and that's Zuni. What we saw in the other cases was either that people did move. We saw the diasporas, and we can trace those, but they lost completely their cultural identity. They assimilated, not surprised, so they didn't move intact as a cultural group to a different place. They moved as people and assimilated into other cultural groups. And so whether you want to call that collapse or loss, I mean, the cultural identity is important to people. The people survived, but the culture did not. And in other cases, we simply have no idea. So in the case of the Hohokam, for instance, they suffered a lot. There was malnutrition, and we just don't know where they went. And that may mean they went into northern Mexico, and we just haven't discovered the sites. We have no idea what happened to them. But the other part I wanted to comment on is this interesting contrast between the narrative that says environment did them in, and the triumphalism that says we overcame. And so one of the things we've been trying to do in the 5 cases we've been studying in the American Southwest is to both look at the social structures that have been linked to resilience or lack thereof, the hierarchy and the rigidity that sometimes makes it easier to move, but sometimes makes it harder to move. But crossing that with, in fact, the magnitude of the environmental stress. And we've done that by going beyond whether or not there was a drought, which is an important first observation, but asking how the climatic changes, which we have annual retrodictions that have some uncertainty, but we could talk about that later, intersected with the subsistence strategies. So even if the landscape was drying, people basically have 3 ways of dealing with shortfalls in those times, right? One was storage, one was to supplement with wild gathered resources, and another was, we could call it trade. Sometimes that's food moving to people, and sometimes that's people moving to food. And so we've asked, how did the climatic changes actually stress those 3 strategies? How often did we see an increase in the number of years in a row when you couldn't have had storage? How much did we see changes in wild resources that were concurrent with changes in yields? And then we asked how often we saw sites on the landscape that had been previously anti-correlated, so might be good trade partners, right? When I'm having a bad year, you're having a good year. Did we see the climatic stresses that said, we've established this relationship of trade now, and that relationship is stressed because previously we were anti-correlated and now we're correlated. And in fact, what we find is that while rigidity and hierarchy play a role in decreasing resilience, the Zuni were probably the least stressed, the group that persisted. Even though they were experiencing climatic changes similar to the other groups, their subsistence strategies were the least stressed by those changes. So it's, as Tim was saying, it's a complicated picture, and we can never implicate either environment or social structure, I don't think.
Just, can I make one quick comment to that? And that is that we've tried to do the same thing in the Maya world, but Mayanists have been so focused on pyramids, and I've tried to redirect them into looking at when the reservoirs were built and get an idea of when the foundations were built, when the dams were built. And I'm hoping that they'll do more of that so that we can get a bigger N to do the kind of things you're doing in the Southwest.
With Charles's question.
I found this absolutely fascinating. I'd like to get you to say something think about the African problem, the Saharan problem. You've talked about the human strategy for dealing with this, forced migration of some kind or another. But if we worry about the other species, is there a connection with Neil's observation about their capacity to move? How does the range, the potential range of all of these species get impacted by the same trends that you were talking about, the driving people backwards and forwards, the change in precipitation regimes and so on?
Okay, a great question. I think it's easier for me to answer that with the Maya example in that case, because I think that the Maya at least are a broad cultural group, let's say. There are 24 different languages, and we have 4 different Mayan linguists at University of Texas in our linguistics program to give you an idea of the richness still of the so-called collapsed culture, right? So in the Maya area, the Maya persisted because they lived in a broad group of ecotones and ecological places, and those folks that lived along coastal areas and in wetlands persisted, whereas the people in the central part didn't. And so if we go back to Neil's idea of a broad range, they had a range through a lot of different environments. The wetter early Holocene, they could live in those highland areas a long way away from the water table, but by the time you got to the drier later Holocene, and you start going through these droughts, bringing us to the Little Ice Age ultimately, and the driest of the Holocene in that case, then people just could not move back into that central area, but there's still those Maya-speaking peoples around the edge, and millions of them. You know, there are 14, 16 million Maya left in these areas. It's harder to say that about North Africa. We know less about them in that case. We don't know, if it was one or how connected those cultural groups were. I don't think they were nearly as connected, but that's just my first reaction to it. There seems to be cultural connections between the people who did have to move out, but I don't know how close those are, and I'm not sure that, I think we'd have to go to an archaeologist who really understands that area better. But for the Maya, I'd say yes. And I wonder about the Zuni in that case, and then in that case, is that because this is a broader range of Zuni peoples, and did they persist because of that, or was it, as Neil would say before, the people or the groups that persist are the ones that have the broadest geographic range?
No, in fact, the Zuni to survive actually collapsed down to what is close to present-day Zuni. They had been scattered in smaller Pueblo-style dwellings, but not of greater geographic extent. I think that, again, I think that climate changes can play out across the landscape in complicated ways, and I would say they got lucky. Yeah. That in other groups where wild gathered resources were declining at the same time as crop yields were declining, that wasn't true for the Zuni. And they also got lucky in that the people that they had chosen as trade partners before this climatic change actually turned out to be sensible trade partners after the climatic change, even though they ended up collapsing into a smaller geographic center.
We have to stop there because that was really a very interesting link-up point between the two kinds of sciences, because I always get rather scared when terms like collapse, extinction, etc. are used in conjunction with things like languages, just to pick up, another proxy, if you like, for culture. Because, things like the Rosetta Stone, which is essentially a translation manual, show that languages don't die. This is another, it's a forced metaphor. You can reconstruct languages from remains.
Languages in those groups. In the Southwest, there are no written languages, so they have died, except for Zuni.
To come back on that, that's true of the Aborigines with their 200 languages, but at Dreamtime, it continues as an oral storytelling cultural trajectory. Now, it begs a whole, I agree, list of questions about whether it has the same meaning for a contemporary audience than it did at various points in history. But it's still a bit of an amber light, which says, don't say it's cut off just because it wasn't written down. Don't say because it was carved in stone. it has no contemporary reconstruction value. But yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful field that you've opened up to us this morning. I'm sorry we have to break here.